G'day friends, Maloa here. Today we are gonna be talking everything about stats and how to prioritize those and get you all squared away for your rating gear. I've got my excellent friend Sapientor who's gonna be doing the whole discussion for us. Over to you, Sape.
A lot of people don't necessarily understand, no matter what role they're on, the priority order of stats that they should be focusing on and what matters most, what matters a good deal, and then what is really not consequential enough to worry about regarding stats, as well as the math that goes into um, uh, various aspects of stats, such as diminishing returns, and I'll get into more detail about that later. But this goes for all roles. The primary stats, meaning might, agility, and will, all give more value as far as basic stats, um, meaning things like crit, mastery, mitigations, um, etc. Outgoing healing, all of it. Then the basic stats do alone. So the first thing that you need to recognize is that if you are, for instance, a heavy armor might-based class, that for every point of might you get three, and well, this is for most classes at least, you get three physical mastery, one crit, one physical mitigation, and one tactical mitigation. And in addition, normally outgoing healing, parry, evade, block, depending on the class. But that's six stats, including five, the mastery and the mitigations, that are that have a higher value, because if you just think of like essences, basic essences, uh, you get less of those than, for instance, crit and finesse and etc. for the same essence value and tier, essentially. So, um, in addition, the other primary stats are are far from useless. I'm just going to use champion as my example today. Agility gives two mastery and two crit and one finesse for each point, in addition to one parry and two outgoing healing. And then will gives one mastery, one outgoing healing, 1.5 physical mitigation, and 1.5 tactical mitigation, as well as one finesse and one resistance. So stats that you're actually trying to accumulate are what are given by those. Um, you're trying to actually build the valuable stats, which are for DPS. As I said, I'll start with crit, finesse, mastery, and both of your mitigations. Everything else, it really doesn't matter. Um, and the best way to optimize um, whenever you are selecting gear, virtues, um, traceries, essences, everything, the best way to get the most total stats that matter um, is to focus on the primary stat value that a piece gives, or a virtue, or um, a heraldry, or etc. Essence and whatnot. A lot of people, I think the essences are a great example of this. I see a lot of people who have like lively essences of their primary stats and vivids of basic stats, and they're simply not realizing that even though upgrading from lively to vivid for a primary stat only increases it by about 100, and then with basics doing the same thing, say with crit, no, let's just go with mastery, um, going from uh, lively to a vivid increases by I'm wearing all vivids. I forgot how much lively's give. 1 second. Pulling it up. Um, okay, so it increases by 150, and then crit increases by almost 300 whenever you upgrade. So they just see that and they think, well, um, that's more of an upgrade than the 100 more might that I would get for upgrading um, my might essence from lively to vivid. That is not the case whatsoever whenever you are calculating the total stats given, because, as I said before, the 100 might actually gives 6, so 600 or close to it, um, of mastery, crit, mitigation. It's not a single stat that it increases, but it increases about 2.5 times as much as upgrading a basic does, the stats that actually want. This also is very important to take into account whenever you're evaluating gear. In general, if a gear piece does not have a primary stat on it, it's not worth wearing. Um, like if you do the math, there are very few pieces, if they don't have a primary stat um, as one of the stats on the gear piece itself, and or um, or a primary essence slot so that you can slot in a primary stat, then it's almost always universally worse. Sorry, there's a lawnmower in the background distracting me a bit, or a chainsaw actually. Um, uh, it's actually worse whenever you break down the math as far as total stats given, even though you may see like a piece that has, like 13k crit and uh, 10k um, mitigation and then 2 basic essence slots, and you think, whoa, that's so much better than this other piece that doesn't have anywhere near that, those figures. But you're not taking into account that a piece with, say, 1500 might, or let's just go with a primary essence slot. Um, if you have a vivid essence of might that you slot into it, that's 1639 might, and multiply that by 6, and you get almost 10,000 total stat, um, like from that alone. Whereas from a basic, you get, a third or so, the basic essence slot. And so you really need to prioritize, and this also comes into effect whenever you're upgrading or you're choosing which traceries to enhance, because traceries, excluding heraldries, whenever you use enhancement runes on them, and it doesn't actually impact the primary um, effect of the tracery. Um, it only impacts and increases the secondary, the stat that's attached to it. So traceries that have, like if you're just evaluating what to upgrade next, because you don't have enough enhancement runes to have everything maxed out, and you see that you've got a bunch of traceries that have mastery and crit and finesse and whatever as their secondary stat, and then you've got one that has might as it, definitely go with might first. This is also why you should always first enhance heraldries, because obviously they have the most total stats. I mean, and that should be obvious to pretty much everyone. Um, and after that, you should enhance the word of crafts that provide um, only one, like heroic precision, grand willpower, etc., that provide only one stat and don't actually provide a by themselves any primary effect, uh, because you have to have multiples of them or combine them to get set bonus primary effects, essentially. But they have a higher value of the stat that they are given. So they come next, and then should prioritize the primary stat essences or secondary traceries, and finally the others that matter to you. You're probably going to have a few traceries with not useless but basically useless secondary stats, because there are, for most classes, uh, word of mastery that provide such valuable primary effects to where the secondary stat um, can be, evade for a DPS class, and it's still worth using that. So, of course, those should be upgraded last, if really at all. It, you can, you know, make the decision yourself. So, um, once you understand that the primary source of stats are your primary stats, then you should recognize that your highest value virtues, as far as increasing the stats that you care about, um, are actually ones that have as their top stat a primary stat. So zeal, determination, and wisdom. And this shocks a lot of people, but for instance, for might classes, um, determination, even though it gives agility, is more valuable whenever you do the math of how it breaks down for the stats that you actually want than, for instance, confidence. Um, and um, it's because agility gives, as I said before, uh, 2 mastery, 2 crit, and 1 finesse, and determination at rank 96 gives 2130 agility. So multiply that by 5, and you got 10.6k, plus the 4680 physical mastery, and then 3610 crit on it, and then the passive bonus of 936 more mastery. All of that, when you add it up, comes to more total value than confidence, even though confidence has 12k crit and 8k finesse, for instance. Um, it actually comes to a higher value than even wit. Um, and in many cases, more um, it's more valuable to slot than valor. For instance, if you are running into problems with overcapping mastery. And I'm going to use that as a segue into the actual stats themselves and what the caps are and what the difference between a soft cap and a hard cap is. So let's start with crit. At 224.5k, could you swap over to my uh, stream
One
at this
second.
point? Mm, Record, I'm on my champ right now, and it's not my main. I could have pushed its stats a little bit higher or cheesed it, but um,
Okay,
I'm not here to show off necessarily nearly as much as to explain.
we're live. We're live.
Okay, so crit. I'm at 224.318 at 224.5k. You reach the maximum crit chance that you can achieve from attaining more crit. Um, but if you continue pushing it higher, then the devastating hit chance, as well as the magnitude of crits and devs, continue increasing. So it has a soft cap. And if you want to go like pure glass cannon and maximize damage as much as possible and or healing, then pushing crit as high as possible, especially like trying to get it to 300k, which is where dev chance caps out, is what you should do if you're able to sacrifice, if you're in a fight where you're taking like no damage and you don't need mitigations at all. um, Crit has a soft cap, um, whereas mastery has a hard cap at 225k. You push it past that, and you're just wasting stats. So you want to be over the hard cap, but as close to it as possible. Um, Mitigations, same thing. They have a hard cap, and that varies based on tier. Um, Finesse has Finesse is a little bit more complicated. It also varies based on tier of the content that you're doing, as well as um, if you are using physical or tactical um, damage sources, because you can get away with, for instance, Brawler has literally no tactical skills. You can so it can get away with a whole lot less finesse because you don't need nearly as much finesse to avoid being blocked, parried, and evaded as you do to avoid being resisted. And one thing that a lot of players in the end game don't know, that isn't obvious, but is very important to note, is that no matter if you're a physical class or a tactical, all damage over time effects are tactical. All bleeds, all, just everything. Like Brawler is the only class that does not have a damage over time in its red line skill. So, um, as I said, tactical skills can be resisted um, a lot more easily if you don't have proper finesse levels. So, for instance, um, let's just use Hunter. Heartseeker, the initial hit is physical, but the bleed that it does for accounts for almost as much damage as the initial hit, and you don't want those bleed ticks being resisted. So, in general, you need to figure out the finesse level that um, you want whenever you're going into um, certain tiers of content, which is, in general, this is not a 100% no resist figure, but 65k for tier 1 and landscape, 75 for tier 2, and 85 for tier 3. If you're a pure tactical class, you probably want to push those numbers a little bit higher um, to avoid your big skills ever being resisted. And if you are a debuffing class, you definitely want to get to the figure of like 92k, I believe, is the in tier 3. Uh, you cannot be resisted at all. Um, so that's incredibly important to to have the proper finesse levels for the tier of what you're going into. And you want to, as a DPS class, build first your offensive stats. You want to cap your offensive stats. And lots of people will sacrifice offensive stats for mitigations because they have heard that they need this amount of mitigations for to go into this content, and that's usually completely wrong. And if you are going into content where you need to actually sacrifice offensive stats for mitigations, then you are doing content that is above your gear level, and your build level, your total stats. Um, there are a few exceptions for certain classes um, where you should sacrifice a little bit of um, mastery or outgoing healing, or um, in order to really boost a single mitigation. But those are for only the hardest fights in the game and only for certain classes. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Um, now I'm going to transition into the math behind what to prioritize first. For all healers and DPS, it's crit, period. Crit, as you increase it, get like every bit that you add to it has the inverse of diminishing returns. And by diminishing returns, if you're not familiar with that term, or phrase rather, mastery is an example of a stat that has diminishing returns. So is outgoing healing. If, as you can see, I've got capped mastery 225k, and it says increases damage of my attacks by 213%. If you have like 120k mastery and you add 5k to it, then you're going from say 100 to 105%. So that's an increase of almost 5% damage as opposed to what you are doing. As you get closer to the cap, though, you say you're at 200 and you go to 205%, that's only a 2.7% or so increase from what you were doing. So that's what diminishing returns is in a nutshell. Um, Crit, however, And mitigations also have the inverse of diminishing returns. They, as they approach their caps, which let's just utilize champion here. The uh, crit chance for champion at 224.5k is 33%. Um, as you get as you approach that, like going from 30 to 33, that is not an increase of a 3% chance just to crit. You have to also calculate the um, the remainder from 100 that you are subtracting. So it's decreasing the amount of normal hits in addition to increasing the number of crits and devs. Higher it gets, and the closer it gets up to 100. I think mitigations are actually an easier way, or an easier um, source of um, explaining how this works mathematically. So, say that you're a tank and you're sitting at, say, 70% mitigation. Whenever you add 1% to that, so you go from 70 to 71%, that is not going to decrease the damage that you take by 1%. It's more like 3% because the math is you're going from taking 30% damage to 29, which is a 3% increase, roughly. So the closer that you get to percentages, um, percentage-based stats to the caps, the more valuable stacking them is. Um, and this is one of the reasons why uh, mitigation percentage increases, as well as crit percentage increases from set bonuses or gear or whatever, is incredibly valuable. Um, you want to make sure that you've got crit mastery, crit at soft cap, mastery at hard cap, finesse at the appropriate level for the tier you're going into, and then work on your mitigations. As far as mitigations go, you need to realize that there are very few fights in this game where non-tanks take large amounts of both physical and tactical damage. So you want to be very flexible with your ability to prioritize one, um, like to know the type of damage you're going to be taking in the fight that you are entering into, and to sacrifice, rather than sacrificing offensive stats, sacrifice the other mitigation to boost the one that is going to matter. And the best way to do this is to have what are called swappy pieces, um, where you can just see here. I've got the same. Um, I've got equipped right now a helmet with two essences that are tactical mitigation, and then I have a copy of it with two essences with physical mitigation. And so if I'm going into a physical heavy fight, I just put that on, and you know, uh, that's the best way to do it. But that requires hoarding a lot of copies of pieces of gear. The reason that's the best way to do it is because you can also, and most people do this a lot, you can also just change virtues. Like um, you need more tactical mitigation, so put on tolerance instead of compassion. But what you're actually doing there is losing um, and losing stats as a whole, because virtues have different essence equivalent um, stat values, and and whereas essences themselves are like the basis. They're the universal stat equivalent uh, that, as far as basic essences, that is, um, by which stats are accumulated. Um, so, uh, as you see here, I mean, my stats are absolutely insane, and this isn't even my main. I'm not pushing everything. I don't have all best in slot gear, etc. And still, I've got history and then 137k physical and 139k tactical mitigation. Um, Pretty absurd if you really understand what you're doing, how high you can push um, your stats in this game. And whenever I see people who have um, what looks to be decent gear, and they're telling me that they've got like 70k tact minute, and that they're having to sacrifice crit in order to get it up to, you know, levels to even be able to do tier 2 content, I just shake my head and, you know, try to explain the math to them if I have the time, and how they should revise that. Really quickly, for other classes, or for other roles rather, um, prioritization for healers is crit first, and then getting outgoing healing to 345k. That is the cap. Um, and um, you can download a plugin called Outgoing Healing that will show you your number, but chances are you're going to be over it anyway. After that, it's straight mitigations. Don't worry about anything else unless you're really trying to min max um, uh, uh, and utilize skills that can be resisted. Like if you're a blue mini and you switch into dissonant stance and use Coda of Fury before a burn phase to buff group damage or whatever, then you want finesse. But in general, while you're building, at least, don't worry about that. Once you get your mitts caps, as well as crit and outgoing healing, then you can concern yourself with that. But yeah, that's for healers. For debuffers, they generally want to for debuffers, they generally want to follow the same rules as DPS, maybe with a little bit more focus on mitigations, um, and definitely with more focus on finesse. Finesse is the most important stat for them, um, because they can't afford to have their you can't afford to have ancient graft resisted, you know, or a mez on a critical target. Uh, that can easily turn into a wipe. For tanks, it's a little bit more complicated, but essentially, once you have the MIT levels that you need, and speaking of MIT levels, really quickly for different tiers, you for light armor classes, for tier one, uh, for light armor, the maximum is 40% mitigation at 100,000. For um, medium, it's 125 thousand for 50% mitigation, and for heavy, it's 150 for 60% mitigation. For tier 2 content, you have to add 15,000 to those figures in order to achieve the same percentage of mitigation. And for tier 3 content, you need to add 30,000 for the same percentage mitigation. So for tanks, they want for tier 3 to cap their emits 180k buffed. After they reach that, then they want appropriate finesse levels to where they're none of their skills are ever resisted. And all tanks besides brawlers, once again, have some uh, skills that can be resisted. So after tanks reach the appropriate mitigation and finesse levels for the tier of what they're doing, there are then two options for what to prioritize next. And that is either uh, morale using supplemental vitality essences, or in most content, evade. Um, because evade has the um, the inverse of diminishing returns rate at the highest slope of block, parry, and evade. And whenever you get hit, or whenever you hit something, before the chance a of the attack critting or is calculated, first the chance of it being blocked, parried, or evaded, as well as partially blocked, parried, or evaded, is calculated. And obviously, if any attack is partially or fully blocked, parried, or evaded, then it can't crit. So you are not only increasing your um, chances of completely avoiding damage, but you are decreasing the amount of crits that are coming in as well. And then tanks, so um, for most content, because um, most fights do not have a huge damage source that's the primary threat that can't be blocked, parried, or evaded. Um, so, uh, in the case of those that do, um, you want to stack supplemental vitality and just boost your morale as high as possible. But for those that don't, just go with evade as high as you can possibly get it. Um, and then there's also crit defense, which does not actually it does not decrease the chances that you will be critted. It decreases the magnitude of uh, uh, of how much crits do to you whenever you get hit, which is not nearly as significant as it sounds, especially if you are not getting critted as very frequently because you're blocking, parrying, and evading, and partially of all of those a huge percentage of the time. But it still matters, as does incoming healing, but once again, not enough to really worry about. Like incoming healing and crit defense are useful and even resistance, um, but they should not be prioritized over evade and morale once you get your mitts and finesse in at appropriate levels for things. So, um, I guess the last thing that I'm going to end on is magnitude. Um, Magnitude of crits and devastating hits is vastly misunderstood. Um, it is an additive stat. So basically, let's just use crit. Um, Whenever you crit, you have um, there's a base of a 50% increase the from of damage or healing from the if it were a normal hit or heal. So it does 50% more just base without any crit value. But for instance, having 224.5k crit gives roughly 45% more. So that makes 195% of an, so almost double what a normal hit would do. And then there are many other things like traits, traceries, or um, skills, like there are many other sources of continuing to push that number up further. And as it gets higher and higher, once again, diminishing returns. So magnitude is not nearly as valuable, especially whenever it's up to, like around 300% as you may think. It's not like increasing your crit magnitude by 1.8% is going to make your crits hit 1.8% harder. No, it's more like it's going to increase the crit mag. If you're at 300, it's going to increase it to 300%. It's going to increase it to 301.8%. So that's an increase of like 0.6%, if that makes sense. It's an additive stat, not cumulative. And that's really important to know whenever you're deciding on, for instance, if you want to slot a Word of Craft Fury, which increases um, devastating magnitude by uh, 8% if you have both of them, but it actually amounts to less than a 0.3% DPS increase, which is it's a bait tracery, basically. So I think I'm going to end there. Could go into a bit more detail, but um, that pretty much covers all of the essentials, and don't want this video to drag on, so wrap it up, Malua.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and have a good day.